Can I start, Dr. Stein?
Yes.
Okay. Am I not visible? Okay, this is screen share. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. The topic for my presentation today is Alzheimer's disease. And the contents which I would be going over are the overview of dementias in general, then epidemiology of the disease, clinical manifestations, pathology, genetics, finally the diagnosis and differential diagnosis, which is very important, and followed by treatment, and finally the prognosis. So dementia, it is a syndrome with many causes. And if we talk about the states, it affects more than 4 million Americans, and it results in a total healthcare cost of more than $100 billion annually. And so what do we mean by dementia? It is an acquired deterioration in cognitive abilities that impairs the successful performance of activities of
So
daily
how is the
living.
day going to turn out, Marisol?
Oh gosh.
So memory is the most common cognitive ability lost with dementia. And 10% of persons greater than 70 and 20 to 40% who are greater than 85, they have clinically identifiable memory loss. In addition to memory loss, the patients can have neuropsychiatric as well as social deficits. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia in elderly, and it also exacts a very heavy emotional toll on family members and caregivers. So the prevalence of Alzheimer's in these states, an estimated 5.8 million Americans aged 65 and older are living with Alzheimer's dementia in 2020. So 80% out of these, as you can see here, are aged 75 or older. And out of the total US population, 1 in 10 people, that is 10%, age 65 and older, have Alzheimer's dementia. Another important point to note is the percentage of people with Alzheimer's dementia, it increases with age. So the statistics speak that 3% of people age 65 to 74, 17% over 75, and 32% of age more than or equal to 85 have this Alzheimer's dementia. So this estimated number of people aged 65 and older comes from a study using the latest data from 2010 US Census and Chicago Health and Aging Project. Moving on to the epidemiology, the most important risk factors for Alzheimer's disease are old age and a positive family history. And the frequency of Alzheimer's increases with each decade of adult life, reaching 20 to 40% of the population over the age of 85. So old age is one of the biggest risk factors. Moving on to the second important risk factors, that is a positive family history. It suggests a genetic cause of Alzheimer's disease, although autosomal dominant inheritance occurs only in 2% of patients. Then female sex is also a risk factor, independent of the fact that women live longer. Then important thing to note here is diabetes. So the association of diabetes and Alzheimer's disease is an area of upcoming research, and it is said that diabetes increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease threefold. And one study has speculated that glucotoxicity, which occurs in diabetes, it can result in structural damage and functional impairment of brain cells and nerves. Also, it can lead to hemorrhage of cerebral blood vessels and increased accumulation of amyloid beta, which is the pathological protein in Alzheimer's. So the clinical manifestations of the disease. We know there's a cognitive deficit. So the cognitive changes, they follow a characteristic pattern. They begin with memory impairment and then spread to language and visuospatial deficits. So once memory loss becomes noticeable to the patient and the spouse, and it falls 1.5 standard deviation below normal, standardized memory tests, the term MCI, which means mild cognitive impairment, is applied. Now, this thing has a very useful prognostic information, because it is said that 50% of patients with mild cognitive impairment, around roughly 12% per year, will progress to Alzheimer's disease over 4 years. Following the disease course, slowly the cognitive problems begin to interfere with activities of daily living. Now, there are two sets of patients. Some of them remain unaware of these difficulties, which we call as anosognosia, while others are acutely attuned to their deficits and are aware. Now, patients may become lost on walks or while driving. This is a very common complaint encountered in a clinical setup. In the middle stages of Alzheimer's, the patient is unable to work. He or she is usually lost and confused and requires daily supervision. Now, language is also one of the faculties that becomes impaired. First, naming, then comprehension, and finally, fluency. In some patients, aphasia is an early and prominent feature. Apraxia also emerges with time, and patients have trouble performing learned sequential motor tasks. Now, visuospatial deficits is also one of the modalities seen, and it begins to interfere with dressing, eating, etc. And patients, they often fail to solve even simple puzzles or geometry, and even simple calculations becomes difficult for them. Finally, in the late stages, the persons may remain ambulatory, but what they do is they wander aimlessly, and loss of judgment and reasoning is inevitable. So there's one other factor in 10% of Alzheimer's disease patients who develop delusions. There's a syndrome known as Capgras syndrome. Herein, the patient believes that a caregiver has been replaced by an imposter, a very common delusion seen in 10% of Alzheimer's patients. Sleep-wake patterns are perturbed and nighttime wandering becomes disturbing, not only to the patient, but also to the entire household. Finally, in the end, the patients might become mute, rigid, incontinent, and bedridden. Generalized seizures might also occur. So the pathology is when autopsy is conducted, the earliest and most severe degeneration is found in medial temporal lobe, which involves the hippocampus, lateral temporal cortex, and nucleus basalis of Meynert. Biochemically, so you can see in the picture here, there is rapid atrophy of medial temporal lobe. At presentation, the MMSE score, which is a clinical screening tool, at 23, you wouldn't see atrophy here, but 7 years later, with a declining MMSE score of 13, atrophy of medial temporal lobe is seen. On cut sections of the brain, there is extreme shrinkage of cerebral cortex, leading to severely enlarged ventricles. And you can see, compare the size of hippocampi, there is extreme shrinkage of hippocampus as well, very typical of Alzheimer's. So biochemically, this is associated with a decrease in acetylcholine. It's synthetic enzyme choline acetyltransferase and nicotinic cholinergic receptor. So everything has got to do with acetylcholine, which is the depleting agent in Alzheimer's. Now, this is related in part to degeneration of cholinergic neurons in the nucleus basalis of Meynert, which we just talked about because of its degeneration. So the characteristic microscopic findings are two, which are neuritic plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So what is a neuritic plaque? It has a dense central amyloid core due to amyloid accumulation surrounded by dystrophic neurites. So when you stain with a thioflavin S stain, this is the image which is seen. The shining part in the center is the central amyloid core. Then the accumulation of A beta in cerebral arterioles is termed amyloid angiopathy. Now, what leads to the accumulation of A beta we'll see in the subsequent slides. Neuritic plaques basically contain central amyloid core, ApoE4 protein, and various other proteins. Then the neurofibrillary tangles, they are composed of abnormally phosphorylated tau protein. They appear as paired helical filaments on electron microscopy. So what is the function of tau protein? It usually binds to and stabilizes microtubules, which take part in transport across the axon. So if it gets hyperphosphorylated, it can no longer bind properly to microtubules, and henceforth its functions are disrupted. So herein we see APP has a very important role. So APP is a protein. So it has neuroprotective and neurotrophic properties. So it is cleaved by three kinds of secretases, which are proteolytic enzymes, alpha, beta, and gamma. So cleavage by alpha secretase, it leads to a non-toxic product. But if it is cleaved by beta or gamma secretase, it leads to toxic products known as A-beta peptide, which finally forms aggregates, which we talked about in previous slides, which is the common toxic product, especially A-beta 42. So excess production of A-beta 42 is a key initiator of cellular damage in Alzheimer's disease. On a side note, the current Alzheimer's research is focused on developing therapies to reduce accumulation of A-beta 42 by either antagonizing the beta or gamma secretases or promoting alpha secretase or clearing the already formed A-beta 42 by the use of specific antibodies. Now, genetics play an important role in this kind of dementia. APP gene on chromosome 21 plays an important role in pathogenesis. So adults with trisomy 21, which we all know Down syndrome, they characteristically develop the typical neuropathologic hallmarks of Alzheimer's if they survive beyond the age 40. So Down syndrome is a very important risk factor due to the play of genetics here. Early onset familial Alzheimer's occurs due to point mutations in the same gene. Then there are two additional Alzheimer's genes, the presenilins. So presenilin 1 is on chromosome 14, and its mutations are the most common cause of early age of onset of familial Alzheimer's disease. So this familial disease, it has an earlier age of onset, mean onset being 45 years, and a shorter and more rapidly progressive course, like mean duration being 6 to 7 years. So the ApoE gene, now apart from these three genes, there is another gene, that is ApoE gene on chromosome 19, which participates in cholesterol transport, is involved in the pathogenesis of late onset familial and sporadic forms of Alzheimer's. Now this has been a very important landmark discovery, because this is one of the most important genetic risk factor and single most important biologic marker associated with Alzheimer's risk. So use of ApoE testing, now there's a caveat to this. Use of ApoE testing in Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, it still remains controversial. It is not indicated as a predictive test in normal persons because its predictive value is still unclear. And many individuals with above levels still might not develop dementia. So coming to the diagnosis, so the initial MRI scans may be normal. So important modalities which can help in diagnosing are PET scan and SPECT scan. So on the right-hand side, you can see the radiological imaging. So the SPECT image of a healthy brain, then the image of a patient with Alzheimer's disease. There is hypoperfusion in the temporoparietal region. So you can see the hypoperfusion due to hypometabolism of glucose. Then you can see here the blue part. Finally, on the left side is the image of Pittsburgh compound B, currently being studied, Alzheimer's disease patient and as compared to the control. So the brain scan on the left is of a patient with mild Alzheimer's disease, and the scan on the right is of the healthy adult. Red areas show in the greatest levels of amyloid. So herein we test the accumulation of A-beta, which is the amyloid protein, and the dark blue, they indicate no amyloid. So you can see the extent of deposition of amyloid in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. Differential diagnosis is very common because it is often the key to diagnose since there is a plethora of dementias, and we need to be very clear while approaching the patient. So apart from Alzheimer's, there are other dementias like frontotemporal lobe dementia, then Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's disease, vascular dementia. So one very important thing to note in Alzheimer's is the memory loss is the first symptom, especially episodic memory loss. So the neuropsychiatry remains normal. There are no behavioral symptoms. Neurology, the scans remain normal. And on imaging, there is atrophy seen of hippocampal area and entorhinal cortex, that is medial temporal lobe. Now compare this with frontotemporal lobe dementia. Herein the first symptom are often behavioral, that is apathy, poor judgment, insight, hyperorality, disinhibition, euphoria, or depression. Memory loss is often late in presentation as compared to Alzheimer's. This is a key difference between the two. Apart from the fact that on imaging in frontotemporal lobe dementia, It spares the posterior parietal lobe, wherein we saw the posterior parietal lobe involvement in Alzheimer's. It usually involves the anterior lobes. Then Lewy body dementia, it involves REM sleep disorders, visual hallucinations, and Parkinsonism features. And here in the hippocampi are larger than seen in Alzheimer's. Vascular dementia, well, it is usually due to vascular causes. Executive decline is very common. Can spare memory. There is motor slowing, spasticity. And then on imaging, you might see infarctions because of the vascular cause, cortical or subcortical infarctions, and confluent white matter. So under treatment, the primary focus is on long-term amelioration of neurological as well as behavioral problems. But also in this disease, you must give proper caregiver support, because caregiver burnout is very common and often results in nursing home placement of the patient. So as a clinician, communication and repeated calm reassurance are of paramount importance. There are even local and national support groups such as Alzheimer's Association, and they are very valuable resources to help these people out. In the early stages of disease, memory aids can be kept, such as notebooks, posted daily reminders. In addition to proven drugs, which we'll see subsequently, antidepressants are used because these patients often show mild to moderate depression. They can be agitated due to their symptoms. So atypical antipsychotics can be used like risperidone, quetiapine, and anticonvulsants if generalized seizures develop. So the treatment protocol states that first, we screen the patient, especially with scoring, MMSE, all elderly patients with memory complaint. So we diagnose and treat them. Finally, if we categorize them into mild, moderate, and severe. So if the disease is mild, we consider treatment with a cholinesterase inhibitor. If it is moderate, we combine it with memantine. And if it is severe, we consider treatment with memantine and add an approved cholinesterase inhibitor as needed. We can discontinue the therapy when patient advances to loss of all cognitive and functional abilities. Now, it is very important to constantly monitor and evaluate the patient. We do a re-evaluation within 2 months and monitor every 6 months. In addition to that, we do counseling of not only the patients, but the caregivers about the treatment expectations. We also consider the potentially reversible causes of cognitive impairment during the investigative tests, like if someone is a chronic alcoholic, vitamin B12 deficiency, or depression, which might present as pseudodementia, and etc. We provide geriatric care management and counseling, and we refer the patients to Alzheimer's disease support groups, as discussed earlier. So the drugs used in Alzheimer's disease treatment, we have two types of drugs, the approved and the experimental ones. The approved are cholinesterase inhibitors, since we saw the main depleted agent is acetylcholine. So we want to inhibit the enzyme cholinesterase, and this is done by 3 drugs, donepezil, rivastigmine, and galantamine. Then there is excitotoxicity, and hence the receptor, NMDA. So we can antagonize the receptor. The drug which does that is memantine. Apart from these well-established drugs, we have experimental drugs whose role is still under evaluation. It can be antioxidants like ginkgo biloba, vitamin E, melatonin, PPAR gamma agonist, pioglitazone, gamma secretase inhibitor, I'll discuss that in the subsequent slide, statins, and others like estrogens, which in one study proved as efficacious, but in another study, they were not proved being protective in case of women. Then anti-inflammatory drugs. So the prospective areas of treatment. So this is a very important slide, since these are ongoing areas of research, which might add to potential treatment benefit of Alzheimer's. So there can be a vaccination against A-beta-42, which we saw the excessive accumulation. It has proven efficacious in mouse models, but sadly in human trials, it has led to meningoencephalitis. But there is still some hope that modifications of vaccine approach using passive immunization with monoclonal antibodies, it can be done. So this is under phase 3 clinical trials. Then use of alpha and beta secretase inhibitors, that diminish production of A-beta-42. Tenofovir and semegestat, they are being studied. If the secretase are inhibited, going back to the mechanism again, we wouldn't have the production of toxic product, that is A-beta-42. So several retrospective studies suggest NSAID's role, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, and HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors, the statins, they may have a protective effect. Again, this is all under areas of study, and nothing has been proven still. There is now a strong interest in relationship between diabetes and Alzheimer's, and insulin regulating studies are now being conducted. So these are the potential areas of future research which might lead to better treatment modalities by studying the genetics of the disease and might add to the only 3 drugs that are available as of now. Finally, I would like to end by giving you a piece of information that this World Alzheimer's Day, every year it is celebrated on September 21st. This year, the theme was, let's talk about dementia and Alzheimer's in particular. So purple ribbon is the symbol. So we can all create awareness regarding the same. As clinicians, provide love and support to not only the patient, but also the caregivers. So take home point, always remember for those who cannot. Thank you everyone for giving a patient ear to my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.